your teeth. You'll teach Thomas bad habits.
I am a bad habit.
Wait, he's not after you.
I'll get him.
Hey guys, what's happening? Niyat here with Film Comics Explained, and as voted for by everyone in the latest poll, today we'll be exploring Sleepy Hollow, the 1999 Gothic supernatural horror directed by Tim Burton, loosely based on Washington Irving's 1820 short story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Starring Johnny Depp, Christina Ricci, Christopher Walken, Michael Gambon, Miranda Richardson, Casper Van Dien, Christopher Lee, Richard Griffiths, Jeffrey Jones, Michael Gough, and Ian McDiarmid. In what many term the Burton Wrangle, it follows the exploits of Ichabod Crane, a police constable from New York City. After being sent to investigate a number of weird murders attributed to a Headless Horseman in the Dutch hamlet of Sleepy Hollow, Crane's powers of deduction are put to the ultimate test.
You have moved the body?
I did.
You must never move the body.
Why not?
Because the stride is gigantic. The attacker rode Masbeth down, turned his horse, came back to clean the head.
The movie opens with the wealthy Peter Van Garrett writing his last will and testament with the utmost of urgency and sealing it with his family crest. After holding the hands of a woman believed to be his wife, Peter rushes off in a carriage to an unknown location with haste. As the driver whips through the landscape, a shadowy figure on a horse rushes past them. Within seconds, the sound of the sword being unsheathed can be heard, prompting Van Garrett to stick his head out the window. Seeing the headless body of his driver at the reins, he jumps out, sacrificing the speed of the carriage for certain death. Not only does my man see a pumpkin-headed scarecrow throwing mad shade, but when Peter hears the sound of the phantom horse behind him, he turns around and is gifted with decapitation. We then cut to New York City in 1799, where a bell can be heard ringing on the Hudson River. As two constables run towards the sound, a man yells at them for help. Seeing the back of his head, they ask if it was Constable Ichabod Crane, and he tells them that it is indeed he, and not only him, but something else he found, which was lately a man. After revealing a bloated body he found in the river, Crane takes it to the station, only to have his commander order they burn the body. The constable pushes back, stating,
Just a moment, if I may, we do not yet know the cause of death.
To which the High Constable simply says,
When you find them in the river, cause of death is drowning.
Ichabod then astutely points out that may be so if they find water in the lungs, and that through pathology, they might be able to determine whether or not he was dead when he went into the river. Shocked by the idea of cutting up a body after death like a heathen, the High Constable tells him that they should instead rest in peace. One piece, as according to God and the New York Department of Health.
What happened to him?
Nothing, sir. Arrested for burglary.
Defeated by everyone's aversion to finding the truth in matters, Crane then heads to the watch house to give a speech on what he thinks should be the future for the justice system. Telling everyone in the courthouse they're now heading into the 19th century, Crane chastises the court for using medieval methods of torture.
I stand up for sense and justice. Our jails overflow with men and women convicted on confessions worth no more than this one.
Constable Crane.
Furious by the flagrant insolence, the burgomaster explains this is a regular routine of blatant disrespect, and that he had the right mind to send Crane to his cell to cool his heels. Despite the warning, the constable continues, begging for his pardon, before asking why he's the only one that thinks they should use their brains, recognize clues, and use a scientific method to solve crimes and truly detect the guilty. Quite fed up with what he considered nonsense, and eager to teach the young man a lesson, the burgomaster explains there's a town upstate called Sleepy Hollow. The insulated and mostly Dutch farming community, 2 days' journey to the north in the Hudson Highlands, has been dealing with a twisted form of savagery. According to reports, 3 people have been murdered there in the past fortnight, each found without a head. He then challenges Ichabod to use these new ideas of his and put them to the ultimate test by discovering who the killer is.
You will take these experimentations of yours to Sleepy Hollow, and there you will detect the murderer.
And so, after packing his unique equipment and important books, and releasing his red cardinal bird from its cage, Ichabod journeys over to the mysterious town of legend. When he finally arrives, he walks past Ichabod to find the locals closing their windows and doors. He also spots a boy saying goodbye to his father, who looks to be taking watch over the town this evening. Reaching the Van Tassel mansion overlooking the small town, he's welcomed in and is quite surprised to find a merry celebration under the circumstances. After being kissed on the cheek by Christina Van Tassel in a friendly game called the Pickety Witch, Ichabod is confronted by her eager suitor, Brom Van Brunt, who insists the stranger immediately reveal his name. Ignoring him, Ichabod is almost knocked out by Brom when Baltus Van Tassel appears from one of the rooms with his wife. Explaining he's hosting this party to raise everyone's spirits, he urges them to avoid raising their voices. Greeting Baltus, Crane heads over with a letter and tells him he's a constable sent from New York City on authority to investigate the murders. And, realizing he was there to help them, Lady Van Tassel requests that he honor them by remaining as their guest until his mission is complete. As Crane is guided up to his room by a servant girl named Sarah, Baltus and the other leaders of Sleepy Hollow convene for a meeting. Crane soon follows him into the meeting room, where Baltus introduces him to the esteemed men, Dr. Thomas Lancaster, Reverend Steenwick, Magistrate Samuel Phillips, and their notary, James Hardenbrook. When asked what his credentials were, Baltus explains he's a simple farmer the town looks to as friend and counsel. Magistrate Phillips then adds that he's also the town landlord and bank, indicating every single person in Sleepy Hollow was in some way or another indebted to the Van Tassel family. Ichabod then proceeds by going over the information that was provided to him, that there were 3 people murdered. First, Peter Van Garrett and his son Dirk Van Garrett, both of them strong, capable men that were found together decapitated, and then the widow Winship, who was found a week later. He asks if anyone was suspected, and the men look at each other confused, with Baltus saying he doesn't understand. Baltus then asks how much his superiors had informed him, and Crane tells him that there were 3 slain, their heads found severed from their bodies. But Steenwick interrupts, saying the heads were not found severed. In fact, they were not found at all. Hardenbrook then leans forward and says that they were taken by the Headless Horseman, taken back to hell.
Pardon, I don't...
Perhaps you had better sit down.
Baltus continues by explaining the Horseman was a Hessian mercenary sent by German princes to keep Americans under the yoke of England. But unlike his compatriots who came for money, the Horseman came for love of carnage. Riding his giant black steed named Daredevil, which actually belonged to Brom in the short story, the Hessian was infamous for taking his horse into battle and chopping off heads at full gallop. Filing down his teeth to add to the ferocity of his appearance, he was so terrifying that it was said to look upon him made your blood run cold.
He was infamous for riding his horse hard into battle, chopping off heads at full gallop.
After being surrounded by the enemy, the Hessian was finally slain in the winter of 79. Running into the western woods not far from Sleepy Hollow, he found twins gathering firewood. But when he put his fingers to his lips, asking them to be quiet, one deliberately broke the piece of wood she was holding, revealing their position. Despite the epic fight that followed, after slaying a number of men, the Hessian was ultimately decapitated by his own sword and buried. The seed of evil has now supposedly risen from the grave and begun his campaign of vengeance.
Are you saying... is that what you believe?
Seeing is believing.
It's at this point that the Reverend places the Van Tassel family Bible in front of Crane, saying that despite the many books of scientific investigation he had, that is the only one he'll need to study. Ichabod opens the first page to see the Van Tassel family tree and notes that they were linked to the Van Garretts that were slain, before dismissing their wild theories, telling them,
Murder needs no ghost come from the grave. We have murders in New York without benefit of ghouls and goblins.
You're a long way from New York, Constable.
While Ichabod begins the investigation, we then see the man in the watchtower beset by a strange evil. A mysterious force begins extinguishing the flames as the man aims his rifle and tells the devil to come out, much to his regret. Unfortunately, after firing a shot at the headless figure, the man is run down and beheaded. The following morning, as Crane is given an old horse called Gunpowder by Killian, a shot is fired in the distance by a rider who screams that the horseman had killed again, bringing all the armed men to the site of the previous night's massacre. As they all look over the ghastly remains, Dr. Lancaster tells Crane the 4th victim is a man named Jonathan Masbeth. Observing the body, Crane tells him it was interesting, stating the head is usually removed to prevent identification of the body, but since everyone still knew this was Jonathan, the motive behind the removal of the head is a crucial piece of the puzzle. After berating Dr. Lancaster for moving the body, Crane finds a number of deep hoofprints in the ground and reenacts how the figure ran Jonathan down. He then pours some potent chemicals onto the site, which give off a violent reaction, indicating there was a powerful singular thrust to the neck.
The wound was cauterized in the very instant, as though the blade itself were red hot, and yet no blistering, no scorched flesh.
The devil's fire.
After Jonathan's funeral service later that day, his son young Masbeth pledges to assist the constable in finding his father's killer. Ichabod initially refuses the offer, when Philip cryptically admits that Jonathan was not the 4th victim, but actually the 5th.
5 victims in 4 graves.
Noticing Steenwick looking not too pleased with Phillips, and realizing trust would be a scarce commodity, Crane decides to recruit the boy as an assistant. With that, Crane, young Masbeth, Killian, and the Undertaker dig the 4 graves up that night, enabling the constable to examine the bodies for clues. Spotting a small cut on the stomach of Widow Winship, Crane brings her body to the morgue, much to the confusion and disgust of Dr. Lancaster. It's here he makes a vital observation that the widow is pregnant, but when he comes outside to speak with the town leaders and explain his discovery, none of them appear to look surprised, and much to his horror, as he and Gunpowder gallop through Sleepy Hollow that night, Crane is met by a Headless Horseman that chases him out of town and smashes his head with a flaming pumpkin. But when the figure makes it around the corner, we discover it was Brom and his friends playing a practical joke on Ichabod. Here I think it's important to reveal some major differences between the film and the short story, as this is actually where the short story abruptly ended. In Washington Irving's Gothic classic, Sleepy Hollow is described as such. From the listless repose of the place and the peculiar character of its inhabitants, who were descendants from the original Dutch settlers, this sequestered glen has long been known by the name of Sleepy Hollow. A drowsy, dreamy influence seems to hang over the land and to pervade the very atmosphere. Some say that the place was bewitched by a high German doctor during the early days of the settlement, others that an old Indian chief, the prophet or wizard of his tribe. Certain it is, the place continues under the sway of some witching power that holds a spell over the minds of the good people, causing them to walk in a continual reverie. They are given to all kinds of marvelous beliefs, are subject to trances and visions, and frequently see strange sights and hear music and voices in the air. The whole neighborhood abounds with local tales, haunted spots, and twilight superstitions. Stars shoot and meteors glare oftener across the valley than in any other part of the country, and the nightmare, with her whole ninefold, seems to make it the favorite scene of her gambles. It's safe to say that a lot of weird stuff has been happening here, but the most infamous spectre in the Hollow and the commander-in-chief of all the powers of the air is the Headless Horseman. Supposedly the restless ghost of a Hessian trooper whose head was shot off by a stray cannonball during some nameless battle of the Revolution, it's believed he now rides forth to the scene of battle in nightly quest of his head. The legend itself, much like the film, revolves around Ichabod Crane, who, unlike the constable in the film, plays an extremely superstitious schoolmaster from Connecticut. Throughout the short story, Ichabod competes with Abram Brombones Van Brunt, who is both the town bully and local hero, for the hand of 18-year-old Katrina Van Tassel, the daughter and sole child of the wealthy farmer Baltus Van Tassel. But unable to force Ichabod into a physical showdown to settle the score, Brom ends up playing a series of pranks on the superstitious schoolmaster. The tensions among the three continues, and when he fails to secure Katrina's hand in marriage, Ichabod ends up riding home. Passing many alleged haunted spots, his active imagination is engorged by the ghost stories, which only makes him more scared when he encounters a cloaked rider. Unsettled by his eerie size and silence, the teacher was horrified to discover the companion's head was not on his shoulders, but on his saddle. In a frenzied race to the bridge where the Hessian is said to vanish according to rule in a flash of fire and brimstone, Ichabod rode for his life. And while he crossed the bridge ahead of the ghoul, we're told Ichabod endeavored to dodge the horrible missile, but too late. It encountered his cranium with a tremendous crash. He was tumbled headlong into the dust, and Gunpowder, the black steed, and the goblin rider passed by like a whirlwind. The next morning, Gunpowder was found eating the grass at his master's gate, but Ichabod had mysteriously disappeared, leaving Katrina to marry Brom, who was said to look exceedingly knowing whenever the story of Ichabod was related, indicating that instead of being killed by the Hessian, Crane had actually been terrified into leaving Sleepy Hollow by another one of Brom's practical jokes. This is where the similarities end, with Burton's film taking on a life of its own. After getting knocked out by a flaming pumpkin, Ichabod begins to remember his horrific past. Blessed with certain gifts and supposedly magic, his mother is hinted at having been killed in a witch hunt. But before we can learn more, Crane wakes up from his nightmare and stumbles into Katrina in the reading room, who strangely both invites him and hides the book she was reading. Katrina explains that her father doesn't want her reading such books, believing that that was the cause for the brain fever that claimed her mother's life. She also tells him that she died 2 years ago, and that her nurse then became Lady Van Tassel. When he asks why nobody told him Van Garrett and Van Tassel family were so closely linked, Katrina says that it wasn't a secret, as there wasn't a person in town that isn't related to either family. The Van Garretts were supposedly the richest family in these parts, and had gifted the Van Tassels with some land in a small cottage. Using this, Baltus Van Tassel was able to thrive, but of course, there's much more to the story.
Take this. It is my gift for you.
No, I have no use for it.
Are you so certain of everything?
Gifting him her mother's book, a a compendium of spells, charms, and devices of the spirit world, Katrina tells him to keep it close to his heart for protection, before taking him to the cottage she spoke of earlier and drawing the same figure in the sand that his mother had done. Spotting a red cardinal, she tells him that she wanted to have one, but didn't have the heart to cage them. Ichabod then also gives her with something his mother gave him, an optical illusion of a red cardinal in a cage that highlights how optics can trick us into believing appearances. When Crane returns to town, he finds the men arguing in secret before a terrified Phillips leaves with all of his possessions. Catching up to the magistrate, Crane asks how he knew the widow was pregnant and is told that she came to him for legal advice to protect the child, but was killed by the Headless Horseman, who, incidentally, arrives to kill Phillips just as he had feared. Much to Crane's terror, the Headless Horseman appears and takes the head, causing him to pass out.
It was a Headless Horseman.
I know.
You don't know because you were not there. It's all true.
Well, of course it is. I told you. Everyone told you.
As the men downstairs begin arguing that they were ripped off with an amateur deductor, Crane appears reinvigorated and requests that they all head out to find the horseman's grave, but is joined by only Masbeth. Venturing deep into the western woods, they find a witch inside a cave that reveals the grave is located at the Tree of the Dead.
You seek the warrior bathed in blood, the Headless Horseman.
Joined by Katrina, the trio locate the grave and realize the skull had been taken by someone that now controlled the Headless Horseman. They also determine the tree is a portal to hell, and that the horseman will continue to take people's heads until his skull is restored to him. But as they make this discovery, the Hessian appears out of the tree and heads towards the Killian home, killing the village midwife Beth, her husband, and even their little boy. He even kills Brom, who puts up a valiant effort when he tries to intervene, leading to Ichabod theorizing the horseman is attacking select targets linked by conspiracy. Amazingly, despite his own injuries, due to the spells cast by Katrina the teenage witch, Crane makes a miraculous recovery, but not before finally remembering that his mother had been condemned for witchcraft by his father in another nightmare. After hearing from Masbeth that his father had been called into an emergency meeting by the Van Garretts before their death, Crane visits Hardenbrook, who reveals Peter Van Garrett had secretly married the widow and wrote a new will that left the estate to her. Because of this, Crane deduces that all of the victims except for Brom were either beneficiaries or witnesses to this new will, and reasons the horseman's master is therefore Baltus Van Tassel, the person who's now inherited the estate. Discovering the constable suspected her father of the crimes, Katrina burns the evidence before Hardenbrook takes his own life out of fear. With everyone freaking out and some even beginning to leave, Steenwick convenes a town meeting in the chapel, just as Baltus runs inside and claims the horseman killed his wife. The horseman then arrives and attacks the church, but as a seed of Satan, finds that he's unable to enter. In the ensuing chaos, the remaining elders turn on each other.
I should be dying for you.
The next person that lays a hand on me, we're gonna pull it!
As Lancaster is about to spill the beans, Steenwick bludgeons him to death and is repaid with a shot through the chest by Baltus, who himself is harpooned through the window and dragged outside by the head-thirsty horseman. Crane initially concludes that Katrina has been controlling the horseman and decides to leave, unable to convict his lover, but then discovers she'd been protecting him all along and that Lady Van Tassel was actually the villain. Revealing her true heritage to Katrina, she explains she came from an impoverished family that were evicted by Van Garrett when they couldn't pay their rent. Van Garrett then gave their cottage to Baltus and his family, leading to her swearing revenge against Van Garrett and all that wronged her. And so, the girl pledged herself to Satan and begged him to raise the horseman to avenge her. After murdering Katrina's mother Elizabeth, Archer manipulated her way into the Van Tassel home, using fear, blackmail and lust to draw the other town leaders into her wicked schemes. Having eliminated all the other heirs and witnesses, and even killing her sister for helping Crane, Archer summons the horseman to finally finish Katrina. Figuring out the supposed dead body of Lady Van Tassel actually belonged to Sarah, Crane and Masbeth make it to the windmill just before the horseman does. Slowing him down in a fiery explosion, they speed over to the Tree of the Dead, only for Crane to be shot in the chest by Archer. Luckily, saved by the book that Katrina gave him, Crane throws the horseman's skull back over to him. Finally freed from his curse, the horseman spares Katrina and attacks Lady Archer instead, giving her a bloody kiss before returning to hell with the witch. With the case solved, Ichabod takes Katrina's hand in marriage and returns to New York City, along with the brave young Masbeth, ready to start their new life at the turn of the new century. With that said, that's all for today, folks. A huge thanks to everyone that voted we explore Sleepy Hollow. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe to stay up to date on all my content, and if there's anything else you'd like to request, please don't hesitate to ask. As always, it's been a pleasure. Niyat here with Film Comics Explained. Thanks for stopping by.